The new maid arrived just as the morning fog began to lift from the iron gates of Vernon Mansion. Her shoes were worn from travel, her dress modest but clean, and in her trembling hands she held a letter of employment signed by the housekeeper. She paused before the great doors, steadying her breath. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and roses, the kind that bloom only in well-tended gardens and behind tall walls. A butler opened the door with practiced precision, his expression unreadable. "You must be the new maid," he said. She nodded, clutching the letter. "Come in, Mrs. Vernon dislikes lateness." His shoes clicked against the marble floor as he led her down a long corridor lined with portraits, faces of solemn men and graceful women, their eyes following every passerby. She kept her gaze lowered, careful not to meet the painted stares. Yet the silence of the house pressed on her chest. The ceilings were so high that her voice, if she dared to speak, might vanish before reaching anyone's ears. When they reached the servants' quarters, the butler handed her a small brass key. "You'll start in the main hall. Dusting, polishing, whatever Mrs. Vernon or the housekeeper assigns. Don't touch anything not meant for you." His tone made it clear, curiosity was dangerous here. Left alone, she unpacked her small bag, 2 changes of clothing, a worn photograph of a little girl, and a folded handkerchief embroidered with the letter R. She touched it gently, as if it might dissolve under her fingers. Then, taking a breath, she tied her hair back, straightened her apron, and went to work. The main hall was enormous, lit by tall windows spilling pale light onto the floor. Dust hung in the air like forgotten time. As she moved from table to shelf, wiping the heavy frames and vases, she caught sight of another painting, larger than the rest, set above the fireplace. The figure was a man in a dark suit, his gaze steady, a hint of warmth in his eyes despite the formality of the pose. Her cloth slipped from her hand. She stepped closer, heart pounding so hard she could hear it. The light shifted across the portrait, illuminating the familiar curve of his jaw, the way his hair fell just slightly to one side. It was impossible, and yet there he was, frozen in oil and varnish, his eyes calm and confident as ever. Her lips parted. "Richard," she whispered, almost too softly to hear. A noise from behind made her turn sharply. Mrs. Vernon had entered, elegant in a morning gown of pale silk. Her expression was cool, detached, the kind of beauty shaped by years of command. "Ah, the new maid," she said. "I trust the butler showed you your place." "Yes, ma'am," the maid murmured, quickly lowering her gaze. She bent to retrieve the cloth, her hands shaking. Mrs. Vernon crossed the room slowly, her perfume faint but sharp. "You'll find this house runs on discipline," the lady continued. "We value silence and precision. If you do your work well, you'll have no trouble here." "Yes, ma'am," the maid repeated, forcing steadiness into her voice. Mrs. Vernon stopped before the fireplace, her eyes lifting toward the portrait. "My late husband," she said. "Lord Richard Vernon. You may have heard of him." The maid's throat tightened. She dared not speak. The name struck like a bell inside her chest, too loud, too clear. The woman went on, unaware of the storm behind the maid's lowered eyes. "He passed 5 years ago," Mrs. Vernon said softly. "This portrait was painted shortly before his death." The maid stared at the floor, her mind spinning with fragments, laughter in a garden, the weight of a hand on hers, a promise whispered in the dark. The child's face flashed in her mind, her daughter's eyes so like his. When Mrs. Vernon turned to leave, the maid finally looked up at the portrait again. Her vision blurred with unshed tears. The man who had once promised her a future stood immortalized in another woman's home, smiling down from a world where his lies were gilded and framed. She pressed the cloth to her lips to muffle the sound of her breath. A single question rose within her, burning, impossible to hold back for long. Why is the father of my daughter in this mansion's portrait? That night, the mansion lay under a pale wash of moonlight, every window dark except for a faint glow spilling from the servants' corridor. The new maid sat on the edge of her narrow bed, her hands clasped around the small locket she had worn hidden beneath her dress all day. Inside it was a photograph, its edges soft from years of touching, a man's face beside hers, smiling in the sunlight of a simpler time. The same face that now hung in the grand hall, staring down from a golden frame. She could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, the portrait flashed before her, Those familiar eyes, that same quiet smile. She rose, her bare feet brushing the cold floorboards, and looked toward the small framed picture of her daughter on the bedside table. "He's here," she whispered. "After all these years, he's here." When morning came, she moved through her chores like someone caught in a dream. The silver tray in her hands rattled faintly, her fingers trembled as she polished the brass handles along the staircase. The housekeeper noticed her distraction and frowned but said nothing. New maids were always nervous their first week. By noon, Mrs. Vernon summoned her to the library. The room smelled of old paper and cedar polish. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and a large window cast dappled light across the rug. Mrs. Vernon sat by the desk, reading correspondence. She didn't look up when the maid entered. "You wished to see me, ma'am," the maid said quietly, standing just inside the door. "Yes." Mrs. Vernon placed her letters aside and adjusted the brooch on her collar. "I understand you've been assigned to the main hall. I trust there have been no issues." The maid hesitated. Her tongue felt heavy, but the question she had carried since yesterday burned too fiercely to stay buried. "Ma'am," she began softly, "there is something I must ask you." Mrs. Vernon finally looked up. "Speak." The maid's voice faltered. She lowered her gaze, then raised it again, her courage gathering in her chest like a storm. "Ma'am, why is the father of my daughter in your mansion's portrait?" The silence that followed was thick enough to swallow the air. Mrs. Vernon blinked once, confusion flickering across her composed features. "What did you say?" The maid took a step forward, her hands twisting the hem of her apron. "The man in the portrait, above the fireplace in the hall. You said he was your husband. Lord Richard Vernon." Mrs. Vernon's voice hardened. He passed away 5 years ago." The maid swallowed. "Then I think there has been a mistake. Because that man was with me 7 years ago. His name was Richard, yes, but he said he was a merchant. He loved me, ma'am. We had a daughter together." The older woman rose slowly from her chair, the faint rustle of her gown the only sound in the room. "You are making a dangerous accusation," she said coldly. "I have no wish to offend you," the maid replied, her voice breaking. "But I saw his face. I could never forget it." She fumbled in her pocket and brought out the locket, stepping closer. "He gave me this. Look inside." Mrs. Vernon hesitated, then opened the locket with trembling fingers. Inside was a faded photograph of her late husband, younger, smiling, his arm around a woman who was clearly the maid. The resemblance was undeniable. The blood drained from her face. This cannot be," she whispered. Tears welled in the maid's eyes. "He told me his name was Richard Hale. He said he would send for me once he returned from business abroad. He never did. I waited. Then I had my daughter, and I thought, perhaps he had died. But now I see he lived here. With you." Mrs. Vernon's grip on the locket tightened until her knuckles went white. "You expect me to believe my husband led a double life? That he fathered your child?" "I don't expect anything," the maid said, her voice shaking. "I only want to know why his portrait hangs in your home, when I buried him long ago in my heart." For a long moment neither woman spoke. The ticking of the clock filled the room like the beat of an approaching truth. Finally, Mrs. Vernon turned toward the window, her shoulders rigid. "Leave me," she said quietly. "Go back to your quarters. This conversation never happened." The maid hesitated, then bowed her head. "Yes, ma'am." She turned to go, but before she reached the door, Mrs. Vernon spoke again, her voice softer now, laced with something that sounded almost like fear. "Bring the child's photograph tomorrow," she said without turning around. "I would like to see her face." The maid froze, then nodded. When she left the library, her heart was still pounding, not from guilt, but from the faint glimmer of hope that, at last, someone might believe her. The next morning dawned gray and heavy with the promise of rain. The maid stood outside the library door again, clutching the small photograph of her daughter. Her stomach twisted with unease. She had not slept. Mrs. Vernon's request echoed through her head all night, her tone half disbelief, half something unspoken. When the housekeeper called her name, she almost didn't hear. Mrs. Vernon was already waiting inside, standing beside the desk rather than seated behind it. The curtains were drawn halfway, casting her face in shadow. "You brought it?" she asked quietly. "Yes, ma'am." The maid stepped forward and placed the photograph on the desk. It showed a little girl of 6 or 7, smiling shyly, her dark curls framing eyes far too old for her age. "Mrs." Vernon looked down at it for a long while. Her hand hovered above the image, as though afraid to touch it. "Her eyes," she murmured. "They're his." The maid's throat tightened. "Everyone says so, Mrs." Vernon lifted her gaze. "Do you know what you are implying? That my husband, my Richard, betrayed me, our vows, and our home." The maid's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to look away. "I don't want to shame you, ma'am. I only speak the truth. He loved me once. I swear it, Mrs." Vernon inhaled sharply and turned toward the shelves, her fingers grazing the spines of the books as if searching for steadiness. "You must understand what such a claim would do to his name," she said. "To this family." Silence hung between them. Outside, the first drops of rain began to patter against the glass. The maid gathered her courage. "I understand, ma'am, but I have proof." From the pocket of her apron, she drew a folded letter, its edges yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. "He wrote this before he left me," she said softly. "It bears his hand, Mrs." Vernon took it hesitantly. The handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, familiar. "My dearest Elena," it began. She read only a few lines before her vision blurred. His words were tender, intimate, filled with promises he had never spoken to her. Her knees weakened, and she sank into the nearest chair. "This is his script," she whispered. "There is no doubt." The maid's voice trembled. "I did not mean for this to come to light. I never wanted to enter your home, but I needed work. When I saw that portrait, enough." "Mrs." Vernon's voice cracked through the air. She rose abruptly, fury and grief warring in her expression. "You expect me to pity you. You were his distraction, nothing more." The maid flinched but did not retreat. "If that is so, then why did he keep this?" She reached into her apron again and pulled out the locket. She opened it, showing Mrs. Vernon the tiny curl of a baby's hair sealed beside Richard's photograph. "He took this from me the night before he left. I thought he carried it always." Mrs. Vernon stared at it, her eyes glistening. "He told me he lost that locket during his travels," she whispered. The realization struck them both at once. He had not lost it, he had lied to them both. A deep stillness filled the room, broken only by the rhythm of the rain. Mrs. Vernon closed her eyes, pressing the letter to her chest. "He deceived us both," she said finally, her voice hollow. "You and I, we are not enemies, only the remnants of one man's deceit." The maid said nothing, but tears slipped silently down her cheeks. For the first time since she arrived, she saw in Mrs. Vernon's face not pride or judgment, but the raw ache of a woman betrayed. Outside, thunder rolled over the fields, as though the heavens themselves were giving voice to the truth neither woman could deny. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the garden soaked and glistening. The mansion seemed quieter than ever, as if the storm had taken something from it, a hidden weight now replaced by uneasy calm. The maid worked in silence, dusting the banisters, her eyes hollow from a sleepless night. Every echo of her footsteps reminded her of the words from the day before, "He deceived us both." By mid-morning, Mrs. Vernon sent for her again. The summons came through the butler, his voice unusually gentle. "The lady wishes to see you in the drawing room," he said, almost as though he pitied her. The maid hesitated before entering. Mrs. Vernon stood by the tall windows, sunlight spilling across her pale gown. She did not turn at once, only watched the glistening leaves outside. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than the maid had ever heard it. "I could not sleep, Mrs. Vernon said. All night, I thought of that letter, and of you." She turned then, her face drawn but calm. "It seems I have been living beside a stranger's memory." The maid lowered her gaze. "I am sorry, ma'am. If I could have undone it, I would. I never wished to harm your peace." Mrs. Vernon crossed the room slowly. "You have a daughter," she said. "She is innocent of all this." "Yes, ma'am," the maid whispered. "Her name is Clara." Mrs. Vernon nodded faintly, then reached toward the tea table where a folded envelope lay. "I had the steward look through some of my husband's papers," she said. "He kept records, meticulous ones. Receipts, letters, donations. Her voice faltered for a moment. And among them, I found this. She handed the maid a page torn from an old account book. There, in Richard Vernon's hand, was a notation. Monthly remittance, Miss E. Ward. Care of Whitby Parish, 1878. The maid's breath caught. He sent money. For nearly a year, Mrs. Vernon said. Then the entries stopped. I believe he tried to keep you safe in his own, cowardly way. But he hid it from us both. The maid pressed the page to her chest, tears blurring her vision. Thank you for showing me this. Mrs. Vernon studied her face for a long moment. I will not have you leave this house, she said finally. The maid blinked in surprise. Ma'am, you will not remain a servant, Mrs. Vernon continued. You and your child will have a home here. My husband's sins have already taken enough from us, I will not let them take your child's dignity too. The maid's lips parted in disbelief. You would do that, for us? Mrs. Vernon's eyes softened, though sorrow lingered in them. We are both what he left behind. Let us build something honest from the ruins he made. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The sunlight shifted through the curtains, dust motes drifting like fragile ghosts between them. Then, slowly, the maid sank to her knees, not in servitude, but in gratitude. Thank you, she whispered, voice trembling. For the first time, I can tell my daughter her father was not just a lie. Mrs. Vernon placed a hand on her shoulder. Tell her instead that two women kept his memory, and turned it into truth. Outside, the clouds broke apart, and light spilled over the drenched gardens. The portrait in the hall still hung untouched, but the house felt changed. Beneath that painted gaze, the two women now stood not as mistress and maid, but as family, bound not by deceit, but by forgiveness.